If my ex wants to visit, he will. I am not your slave." Kesha Washington's voice cut through the living room like a blade through silk. Sharp, final, untouchable. Jerome Washington stood in the doorway of his own home, holding a small velvet box containing $800 worth of diamond earrings he'd spent 2 weeks selecting for her birthday tomorrow. His wife of 3 years. The woman he'd worked 60-hour weeks to provide for. The woman who hadn't contributed a single dollar to their household in 1,095 days. Behind her, sprawled across the cream leather sofa Jerome had saved 3 months to buy, sat Troy Mitchell, Kesha's ex-boyfriend, feet up on the coffee table like he owned the place, designer jeans, expensive watch, and in his palm, catching the light just right, a house key, Jerome's house key. What Jerome did next would strip her of everything in 72 hours. Comment where you're listening from, subscribe to channel. Let me tell you who Jerome Washington really was. Not the controlling husband Kesha would later claim to social media. Not the financially abusive partner she'd cry about to friends. The real Jerome. The one nobody bothered to see because he was too busy making sure everyone else was comfortable. Jerome grew up on the south side of Atlanta, in a neighborhood where opportunity came with conditions attached. His mother worked 2 jobs, one as a hospital custodian during the day, another cleaning office buildings at night, just to keep their small apartment. His father had left when Jerome was 7, leaving behind nothing but child support payments that arrived sporadically, if at all. But here's what nobody knew. While his classmates struggled with basic algebra, Jerome was teaching himself programming languages from library books. While they complained about homework, he was building computers from spare parts he'd salvaged from the school's electronics recycling bin. By 15, he was fixing neighbors' computers for cash. By 17, he'd built a predictive analytics program that could forecast local crime patterns with 87% accuracy. He never told anyone about that last one. Too many questions. Too many ways for a black teenager with that kind of skill to end up on the wrong side of authorities' attention. Jerome went to Georgia Tech on a full scholarship, the kind reserved for students whose test scores were too high to ignore, no matter their zip code. He worked campus security on weekends, delivered food on a bike between classes, and graduated with a 3.9 GPA, while most of his peers partied their way through 4 years their parents had already paid for. He got hired at a mid-sized software company 3 days after graduation. Not the Google offer his white classmates walked into. Not the 6-figure signing bonus, just a steady paycheck, benefits, and the promise that hard work would be rewarded. Jerome believed that promise. That was his first mistake. He met Kesha Williams at a mutual friend's barbecue when he was 29. She was 29 too. Beautiful, charming, and carrying herself with the confidence of someone who'd never had to worry about where their next meal was coming from. She worked part-time at a boutique, more for something to do than from financial necessity, she'd laughed. Her parents were comfortable. She was comfortable. Jerome found that comfort intoxicating after a lifetime of struggle. 6 months later, they were engaged. A year after that, married in a small ceremony that Jerome paid for entirely. Kesha's parents contributed nothing, citing tradition that the groom's family should handle expenses. Jerome's mother, bless her, had scraped together $2,000. It wasn't enough for the wedding Kesha wanted, so Jerome took out a small loan to cover the difference. Mini cliffhanger. What Jerome didn't realize was that he'd just established a pattern that would define their entire marriage. He provides, she receives, he works, she enjoys. He asks for nothing, she gives nothing, not even respect. The house on Maple Ridge Drive was Jerome's, purchased 6 months before the wedding with money he'd saved since his first paycheck at 22. His name on the deed, his down payment, his mortgage. Kesha moved in after the wedding, like she was moving into a hotel suite someone else had booked for her. The joint checking account was Jerome's idea. He wanted Keisha to feel secure, to have access to money whenever she needed it. But here's what they didn't tell you about joint accounts. Joint access doesn't mean joint ownership. Jerome opened that account. Jerome made every single deposit. Keisha was an authorized user, not an owner. She could spend the money, but legally it was his. Same with the credit cards. Keisha Washington wasn't a cardholder. She was an authorized user on Jerome Washington's accounts. The difference would matter later. The difference would matter more than Keisha could ever imagine. 3 years passed. 3 years of Jerome waking up at 6 a.m. to get to the office by 7:30. 3 years of 60-hour work weeks, of skipped lunches to save money, of saying no to drinks with colleagues because every dollar mattered when you were the only one earning. 3 years of coming home to a wife who'd spent the day doing what, exactly? Not working. Keisha had quit her boutique job 2 months after the wedding. "It's so stressful," she'd said, "and we don't really need the money, right?" Not cooking. Most nights, Jerome came home to take out containers or suggestions they go out to eat. On his credit card, of course, not managing the household. The mortgage, utilities, insurance, car payments, groceries. Jerome handled it all. Keisha couldn't even tell you how much their water bill was. What happened next will shock you. The evening of June 15th started like any other. Jerome left work at 6 p.m., early by his standards, with that velvet box in his jacket pocket. Keisha's birthday was tomorrow, 32 years old. He'd planned a nice dinner at her favorite restaurant. Made reservations. Everything was supposed to be perfect. He pulled into the driveway at 6:30 and noticed an unfamiliar car parked on the street. Expensive. New. The kind of car Jerome couldn't afford despite his engineering salary because he was too busy paying for everything else. The front door was unlocked. Not unusual. Keisha was careless about security. But when Jerome stepped inside, he smelled cologne that wasn't his, heard laughter that wasn't his wife's, saw a jacket on the coat hook by the door, the hook Jerome used every single day. That was when he rounded the corner and found them. Troy Mitchell, Keisha's ex-boyfriend, the one she'd dated before Jerome, the one she'd claimed was just a friend from way back, sitting on Jerome's sofa with his size 12 Jordans propped up on Jerome's coffee table, sharing lo mein straight from the container with Jerome's wife. 2 wine glasses on the table, both half empty, the good wine glasses from their wedding registry. "Hey, baby," Keisha said without looking up. Her voice had that fake, casual tone Jerome had been hearing more often lately. Troy stopped by to catch up. She finally glanced at Jerome, and something cold flickered in her dark eyes. "Hope you don't mind." The way she said it made it clear she didn't care whether he minded or not. Troy grinned up at Jerome with the kind of smug satisfaction that made decent men want to throw punches. "What's good, Jerome? Long day at the office?" The mockery was thick as honey. This man knew Jerome worked long hours. He probably knew Jerome's schedule better than Jerome wanted to think about. Jerome set his laptop bag down slowly. His engineer's mind was already cataloging details. Troy's jacket on the hook, the wine glasses, the way they sat close together on the sofa. Too close for any married woman should sit next to any ex-boyfriend. "Actually, yeah," Jerome said evenly. "Long day, Troy. I think it's time you headed out." He kept his voice level, professional. The way he'd learned to handle difficult clients. But Keisha's head snapped up like he'd just insulted her personally. "Excuse me." Her voice went sharp and high. "Troy's my friend, Jerome. He can visit whenever he wants." She stood up, all 5'6" of attitude and perfectly curled hair. Every inch of her bristled with offense at his reasonable request. This is when everything changed. I am not your slave, Kesha said, her voice rising. If my ex wants to visit, he will. The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Troy chuckled and stretched his arms along the back of the sofa, like he was settling in for the night. Jerome's hand went instinctively to his jacket pocket, feeling the small velvet box. Happy birthday, baby. The irony almost made him laugh. Instead, he found himself studying Troy with methodical attention. The man wore an expensive watch, designer jeans, and an air of ownership that extended far beyond the sofa. But what caught Jerome's attention was something much smaller and infinitely more significant. The glint of metal in Troy's palm as he gestured. A key, a house key, Jerome's house key. You gave him a key. The question came out quieter than Jerome intended, almost conversational. Kesha's chin lifted defiantly. It's not a big deal, Jerome. God, you're so paranoid. But her eyes wouldn't meet his. That told him everything he needed to know. Troy held up the key with a grin that could have powered the Atlanta skyline. She wanted me to have it, man, for emergencies. He winked at Kesha, who actually giggled. But there was one thing Jerome noticed that made his blood run cold. Troy's laptop sat open on the side table. Except it wasn't Troy's laptop at all. Jerome recognized the scratched corner and the company stickers immediately. It was his work laptop. The one containing 18 months of proprietary code for the $2 million software project that would either make his career or break it. The laptop he'd explicitly told Kesha never to let anyone else use. Not even for checking email. Troy was scrolling through files like he owned them, and from the angle Jerome could see, they weren't just any files. They were the core algorithms Jerome had been developing in secret. The ones that could revolutionize predictive analytics if they fell into the right hands, or destroy his entire future if they fell into the wrong ones. Troy, Jerome's voice stayed steady, but something arctic crept into his tone. Close that laptop. Now. He took a step forward. For the first time that evening, Troy's smirk faltered slightly. But Kesha jumped between them like she was protecting Troy from some unreasonable attack. Jerome, what is wrong with you? Her voice carried that tone he'd been hearing more and more lately. The one that made him sound crazy for noticing obvious problems. He's just checking his email. You're being completely paranoid. Then she added the words that would haunt her for the next 72 hours. This jealousy thing is really getting old. Troy leaned back with renewed confidence, clearly enjoying the protection. Man, you need to chill. Your wife was just being hospitable. He gestured at the laptop without closing it. She said I could use it for a few minutes. What's the big deal? The casual way he said, your wife, dripped with implications. Mini cliffhanger. Jerome pulled out his phone and opened the voice recording app. A habit from work meetings that had saved his career more than once. The big deal, Jerome said quietly, is that laptop contains proprietary code worth more than most people's houses. Code that could get me fired and sued if it ends up in the wrong hands. He looked directly at Kesha. Code you know I'm not supposed to share with anyone, ever. Kesha rolled her eyes with theatrical exasperation. Oh my God, Jerome, it's just a computer. Troy isn't going to steal your precious secrets. She turned to Troy with an apologetic smile that cut deeper than any insult. I'm sorry, baby. He gets like this sometimes. Baby. She called him baby, right in front of Jerome, in Jerome's own living room. Troy's grin widened as he finally closed the laptop, but not before Jerome caught him quickly minimizing several windows. No worries, Kesha, I get it. Troy stood up slowly, making a show of stretching. Some men just can't handle their women having male friends. His eyes swept over the living room, lingering on the electronics, the furniture, the wine glasses. especially when those friends can actually afford to take care of them properly. He said afford, like Jerome was poor. Jerome, who paid for literally everything in this house. Jerome, who'd saved for 3 months just to buy that sofa Troy had been sprawling across. Must be hard, Troy continued, working so much and still not being able to give your girl the lifestyle she deserves. Jerome felt heat rise in his chest, but he kept recording. This conversation was too revealing to trust to memory. What lifestyle would that be, Troy? Jerome asked conversationally. Troy's smile turned predatory. Well, like that tennis bracelet she's wearing, the one I bought her last week, or those earrings from Tuesday's dinner. Jerome's eyes snapped to Kesha's wrist and ears. Sure enough, there was jewelry he'd never seen before. Expensive jewelry, the kind that cost more than Jerome spent on groceries in a month. Kesha's hand moved instinctively to cover the bracelet, but it was too late. Those are just friendship gifts, Kesha said quickly, but her voice had gone higher. Troy has always been generous. It doesn't mean anything. She was looking everywhere except at Jerome. The truth they buried for 3 years was about to destroy everything. Jerome looked around his own living room with new eyes. The Wi-Fi password had been changed 3 days ago. He'd noticed but hadn't thought much of it. The joint credit card statements had stopped coming to his email. Kesha said she'd handle them to reduce his stress. Their shared Netflix account showed romantic movies he'd never watched, viewed during the day while he was at the office. Small things, individually meaningless. But together they formed a pattern that made his stomach turn. This wasn't the first time Troy had been in their house. This wasn't even the first time he'd been alone with Kesha. The wine glasses, the comfortable way Troy navigated their space. The key. It all painted a picture Jerome had been too trusting to see. His wife hadn't just let her ex into their home. She'd been entertaining him regularly while Jerome worked 60-hour weeks to pay for everything she took for granted. Troy was still talking, something about how a real man would trust his woman with her friendships. But Jerome was no longer listening. He was calculating, planning, recording every word for the conversation that would matter later. Jerome excused himself to the kitchen under the pretense of getting water. But really, he needed space to think without Troy's smug face in his peripheral vision. The voices from the living room carried clearly. Kesha's laughter, Troy's low rumble of satisfaction, the sound of his own marriage dissolving in real time. He leaned against the granite countertop, the granite he'd chosen, that he'd paid for, and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger, something more dangerous. Clarity. What happened next would cost Kesha everything. The birthday gift in his pocket felt like lead. 2 weeks of research. $800 saved by bringing lunch to work every single day. For a woman accepting expensive gifts from another man while calling her husband paranoid. Jerome pulled out the velvet box and set it on the counter, staring at it like evidence of his own foolishness. Tomorrow was supposed to be special. The earrings were meant to match the necklace he'd given her for their anniversary. The necklace she'd stopped wearing 2 months ago. He could hear Troy getting comfortable in the living room, settling in like he owned the place. Jerome didn't storm back in. He didn't shout or demand explanations. Instead, he opened the junk drawer and pulled out a small notebook, the one with important passwords and account numbers. Information Kesha had never needed because she'd never handled the real business of their life. Jerome flipped through pages of neat handwriting, mortgage account numbers, investment portfolios, the deed to the house, purchased 6 months before their wedding with only his name on it, the joint checking account that was joint in name only. His lawyer friend Marcus had set it up that way, joking about keeping options open. At the time, Jerome had laughed it off. Now it felt like prophecy. The house grew quiet. Troy was finally leaving. Kesha's footsteps on the stairs, her voice calling down, Jerome, you okay? Artificial sweetness, testing the waters after pushing too far. Fine, he called back. Just cleaning up. He listened to her moving around upstairs, getting ready for bed like nothing had changed. Like she hadn't just humiliated him while wearing jewelry purchased by another man. Jerome pulled out his phone and scrolled to Marcus Stevens' number, his roommate from Georgia Tech, now a family law attorney who'd always been suspicious of Keisha's financial dependence. Instead of calling, Jerome opened his notes app and began documenting. Asset lists, timeline of behavior changes, credit card charges for restaurants he'd never been to, phone calls that stopped when he entered rooms. He built a case file with methodical precision. By the time Kesha came downstairs in silk pajamas, the ones Troy had probably seen, Jerome had made his decision. Not the hot-blooded choice of a betrayed husband, but the cold calculation of a man pushed too far by someone who'd mistaken patience for weakness. He looked at his wife and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face, someone comfortable taking everything he provided while giving loyalty elsewhere. "I'm going to bed," Jerome said quietly. Keisha smiled, the kind that used to make his heart race. "Good. It's been a long day." She moved to kiss his cheek, but he stepped away just enough that her lips found only air. Confusion flickered across her face. Then she shrugged and headed upstairs, leaving Jerome alone with his thoughts and plans. He took the velvet jewelry box and placed it in the junk drawer next to the notebook full of account numbers she didn't know existed. Tomorrow would be her birthday, but not a celebration. It would be the day everything changed. This is when Jerome made a choice that would cost everything. Torporum. Jerome's alarm never sounded because he never went to sleep. By 4:30 in the morning, he sat at the kitchen table with 2 suitcases packed and a handwritten note beside a single house key. His copy, since Troy apparently had the other one. The note was short, direct, devastating in its simplicity. He'd rewritten it 3 times before settling on words that carried the weight of finality without the burden of anger. "When you said you're not my slave, I understood you want freedom. Now you have it." The coffee maker gurgled in the darkness as Jerome made one last cup in his own kitchen. Everything looked different in the pre-dawn light, like he was seeing his life from the outside for the first time. The granite counters he'd chosen, the stainless steel appliances he'd researched for weeks, the breakfast bar where he'd eaten cereal alone most mornings while Keisha slept late upstairs. It had never really been their house, he realized. It had always been his house where she happened to live. Marcus answered on the second ring despite the early hour. Lawyers, Jerome had learned, were accustomed to crisis calls. "Jerome, everything okay?" His friend's voice was alert, professional. "I need that favor you offered at your wedding," Jerome said without preamble. "The one where you said you'd help me protect my assets if I ever got smart." There was a pause. Then Marcus's tone shifted to something sharper, more focused. "What happened?" Jerome gave him the abbreviated version, the key, the laptop, the jewelry, the humiliation. Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of understanding that told Jerome his friend wasn't surprised. "How bad is the financial exposure?" Marcus asked when Jerome finished. "That's what I need to know." Jerome pulled out his notebook and began reading. Account numbers, asset values, ownership structures. The house, solely in his name, purchased before marriage. The investment accounts, individual accounts with Kesha as beneficiary, not co-owner. The checking account, joint access, but individual ownership. The credit cards, authorized user status for Kesha, but Jerome as primary holder. Even their car was titled in his name only, a detail from their early dating days when her credit had been questionable. Marcus whistled low. You did this intentionally? Jerome almost laughed. No, I just never got around to changing things. Guess my subconscious was smarter than my heart. His friend's voice carried grim satisfaction. This is actually manageable, Jerome. More than manageable. You're in a position of strength here, not weakness. Mini cliffhanger. But we need to move fast, Marcus continued, before she figures out how exposed she really is. They talked strategy for 20 minutes. Marcus outlined steps that sounded almost military in their precision. By 6 a.m., Jerome was in his car with his suitcases in the trunk and a new clarity about his next moves. The first call went to his bank. A sleepy customer service representative confirmed that joint account holders could place holds on unusual activity with 24 hours' notice. The second call went to the credit card companies. Jerome requested immediate spending limit reductions on all authorized user cards due to potential fraudulent activity. The third call went to his property management company. Yes, he'd need them to send a formal notice about occupancy rights and rental obligations for non-owners. The sun was just breaking over Atlanta's skyline when Jerome pulled into the parking lot of an extended stay hotel near his office. Clean, functional, anonymous. He checked in under his own name with his own credit card. Then sat in the generic room and made the call that would change everything. His phone buzzed with a text from Kesha. Where are you? Your coffee is getting cold. Jerome stared at the message for a long moment, then turned off his phone without responding. The final piece of his morning routine took place in the hotel's business center. He logged into accounts Kesha had never bothered to learn existed. The property tax account that showed his sole ownership of their house, the utilities accounts that had always been in his name because he'd set them up before they were married, the insurance policies, the investment portfolios, the small business account for his freelance consulting work. One by one, he updated contact information and security settings, creating a digital fortress around his financial life. By 8 a.m., Jerome was at his desk at the software company, looking like any other day at the office. His coworkers saw a man in a pressed shirt checking email and reviewing code. They didn't see someone who had just activated a carefully constructed legal mechanism that would strip his wife of everything she'd taken for granted. The beauty of it was its simplicity. He wasn't taking anything from Kesha, because she'd never legally owned any of it. He was simply reclaiming control of his own life. Here's what they didn't want you to know. His phone stayed off all morning, but Jerome could imagine the sequence of events unfolding at home. Kesha waking up to find his side of the bed unslept in. The note by the coffee maker. The realization that this wasn't some dramatic gesture but a permanent departure. By lunchtime, she'd be calling. By evening, she'd be panicking. And sometime in the next 24 hours, she'd discover that the comfortable life she'd been taking for granted had never actually belonged to her at all. At exactly 11:47 a.m., Jerome's phone lit up like a Christmas tree. 23 missed calls from Kesha in the span of 10 minutes, followed by a string of text messages that escalated from confused to angry to desperate in real time. Where are you? This isn't funny, Jerome. I'm serious, call me back. What do you mean by this note, Jerome? He watched the notifications pile up from his desk, feeling strangely detached, like he was observing someone else's crisis from a safe distance. The first sign of financial reality hit at 12:15 p.m. Keisha tried to order lunch from her favorite overpriced bistro, the one where she and Troy had probably shared multiple meals while Jerome worked late. The credit card declined. Then the backup card declined. Jerome's phone buzzed with frantic calls that he let go straight to voicemail. By 1:15 p.m., she'd figured out how to check the bank balance online, only to discover that while she could see their joint account, she couldn't access any funds without Jerome's secondary authorization, a security feature he'd activated that morning. Troy apparently was having his own awakening. Jerome's work laptop had been remotely locked and wiped at 9 a.m. sharp. Standard protocol for potential security breaches that Jerome had reported to his company's IT department. Any files Troy might have accessed were now gone, along with his ability to impress anyone with Jerome's proprietary code. The man who'd acted like he owned Jerome's living room was probably staring at a blank screen, wondering how his easy mark had suddenly become so complicated. Jerome's sister Tasha called at 2:30 p.m., her voice tight with confusion. "Jerome, what's going on? Kesha just called me crying, saying you left her some crazy note and disappeared. She wants to know if I've seen you." Jerome could hear the uncertainty in his sister's voice. Tasha had never particularly liked Kesha, but family loyalty ran deep. "I'm fine, Tasha. Just making some changes. I'll call you later to explain." He hung up before she could ask more questions. But he could imagine similar conversations happening across their social circle as Kesha worked through his contact list, looking for allies. What Kesha did next would reveal everything. The beauty of Jerome's strategy was its surgical precision. He wasn't destroying Kesha's life. He was revealing that her life had always been built on foundations that belonged to someone else. The house she entertained Troy in? Jerome's house? The credit cards she used for expensive lunches? Jerome's credit? The comfortable lifestyle that had given her the confidence to humiliate him? Jerome's 60-hour work weeks and careful financial planning? Without his active participation, her world wasn't just damaged. It simply didn't exist. By 4 p.m., the social dominoes were falling fast. Jerome's phone showed missed calls from Kesha's mother, her best friend, and 3 of their mutual acquaintances. Word was spreading through their circle that something serious had happened, and not in a way that made Kesha look sympathetic. When a man quietly packs his bags and leaves a polite note, people don't assume he's the problem. They assume he finally got tired of being one. Jerome's reputation as the patient, hard-working husband who'd put up with more than he should have was about to become his greatest asset. The final call of the day came at 6:20 p.m. Not from Kesha, but from a number Jerome didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. But something made him pick up. "Mr. Washington? This is Sandra Morrison from Peachtree Property Management. We had some questions about the rental notice you submitted this morning regarding your property on Maple Ridge Drive." Jerome felt cold satisfaction settle in his chest. The wheels were turning exactly as Marcus had predicted. "What kind of questions?" he asked, though he already knew what was coming. "Well, sir, we have someone at the property claiming to be a co-owner, but our records show only your name on the deed. She's quite upset about the notice, and we wanted to confirm the situation before proceeding." Jerome could hear voices in the background. Kesha's voice, high and strained, arguing with someone about her rights. Rights she'd never bothered to secure because she'd assumed Jerome's love meant everything he owned was automatically hers too. "The deed is correct," Jerome said calmly. "I'm the sole owner. Please proceed with standard protocols for notification of occupancy terms." There was a pause. Then Sandra's professional tone returned. "Understood, sir. The 30-day notice will be served this evening. Comment where you're listening from. Subscribe to channel." The next morning brought a cascade of consequences that even Jerome hadn't fully anticipated. His phone buzzed with a voicemail from Keisha at 6:00 a.m. Her voice raw from crying or screaming, or both. "Jerome, they're saying I have to pay $3,000 a month to stay in my own house." "My own house? You can't do this to me. This is insane. I don't understand what's happening." The desperation in her voice might have moved him 24 hours ago. Now it just sounded like someone finally waking up to reality. The utilities companies had been efficient. By Thursday afternoon, the electricity, water, and gas accounts had all been transferred to a new billing cycle, one that required immediate payment from the account holder, Jerome, or disconnection within 72 hours. Since Jerome wasn't living there and hadn't authorized continued service, the countdown had begun. Kesha could flip switches and turn faucets all she wanted, but the house was becoming an expensive shell around her, and she had no legal standing to maintain any of it. Jerome's co-worker, Mike, knocked on his cubicle wall around 10:00 a.m. "Hey man, someone named Troy called the main office looking for you. Said it was urgent about some kind of file transfer." Jerome didn't look up from his code review. "Did you tell him I was unavailable?" Mike nodded, looking puzzled. "Yeah, but he seemed pretty upset. Said something about a project you two were working on." Jerome finally raised his eyes. Mike took a step back from whatever he saw there. "I don't have any projects with Troy," Jerome said evenly. "If he calls again, refer him to legal." The laptop incident had been more devastating than Jerome had hoped. Not only had Troy lost access to Jerome's proprietary code, but the remote wipe had triggered an automatic security audit, one that flagged unusual access patterns from the previous day. Jerome's company took intellectual property seriously. The idea that someone outside the company had been browsing their systems meant investigations, reports. The kind of paperwork that made Troy's casual violation of Jerome's trust look like the potentially criminal act it actually was. At noon, Jerome got the call he'd been waiting for. Marcus's voice carried grim satisfaction. "It's worse than she thought, Jerome. A lot worse." Jerome found himself walking to the office parking garage for privacy. "How bad is bad?" Marcus's laugh was sharp. "The mortgage payment is due in 12 days and she can't make it without access to your accounts. The homeowner's insurance is about to lapse because it's tied to your credit card, which has been frozen." He paused. "If she doesn't come up with proof of insurance, the mortgage company will force place their own coverage at about 4 times the normal cost, then add it to her monthly payment. Except she can't make the monthly payment anyway," Marcus continued, "because she never qualified for the loan in the first place." Jerome felt something cold and final settle in his stomach. "How bad is bad?" "She called my office this morning demanding that I represent her in forcing you to honor your marital obligations." Marcus's voice held professional amusement. "When I explained that I represent you, not her, she threatened to sue me for ethics violations. Then she threatened to sue you for abandonment, fraud, and emotional distress." Jerome's jaw tightened. "Can she?" His friend's voice went professional. "She can try, but she'd be suing for control of assets that were never legally hers, in a marriage that she effectively terminated by giving another man keys to your house." That was her biggest mistake. The afternoon brought a new level of desperation. Kesha's texts shifted from angry to bargaining to something approaching panic. "Jerome, I went to the bank. They said I can't access our savings without your signature. How am I supposed to buy groceries? How am I supposed to live?" The question hung in the digital space between them, and Jerome realized she genuinely didn't know. For 3 years of marriage, Kesha had never handled a utility bill, never negotiated a lease, never worried about where money came from, because it had always just appeared in accounts she could access but didn't own. By evening, the social pressure was intensifying from unexpected directions. Jerome's mother called, her voice carefully neutral. "Son, I got a call from Kesha's mother. She's very upset about this situation. Says Kesha doesn't understand what she did wrong." Jerome closed his eyes, knowing this conversation was inevitable, but dreading it anyway. "What do you think she did wrong, Mama?" There was a long pause. "I think she forgot that a marriage is supposed to have 2 people in it, not 3. His mother's voice softened. "But Jerome, that girl doesn't know how to take care of herself. What's going to happen to her?" The question his mother couldn't ask hung between them. What kind of man leaves his wife with nothing? But Jerome had spent the day reviewing bank statements, credit card bills, and financial records that painted a picture his mother couldn't see. Keisha hadn't been left with nothing. She'd been revealed to have never had anything of her own in the first place. The comfortable lifestyle, the financial security, the house she'd been entertaining Troy in. All of it had always belonged to Jerome. He'd just stopped pretending otherwise. The final revelation came in a text at 9:00 p.m. Not from Kesha, but from Troy himself. "Man, your wife is blowing up my phone asking for money. I'm not trying to get involved in your domestic drama. Tell her to stop calling me." Jerome stared at the message for a long moment. Screenshot it. Then deleted the conversation. Even her backup plan was abandoning her. And everyone in their social circle would know it soon. The man who'd been so confident about taking care of Kesha properly had disappeared the moment actually taking care of her became his responsibility instead of Jerome's. Let me ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to find out they were building a whole different life behind your back? Friday morning brought the kind of revelation that cuts deeper than financial loss. The discovery of who people really are when stakes get real. Jerome's sister Tasha called, her voice carrying the tone of someone who'd spent the night getting unwelcome education. "Jerome, Kesha didn't just ask if I'd seen you yesterday. She asked for $3,000 for emergency expenses while you two work things out." Jerome set down his coffee carefully. "What did you tell her?" Tasha's laugh was bitter. "I told her I didn't have that kind of money, but Jerome, she got nasty, started talking about how you've always been controlling with finances, how this is manipulation to force her back into being your obedient wife." The protective anger in his sister's voice was unmistakable. "She's telling people you're financially abusing her, making herself the victim." The narrative made strategic sense. Frame Jerome as controlling, herself as trapped, Troy as supportive friend. But Jerome knew their social circle better than Kesha apparently did. Marcus called at lunch with an update that almost made Jerome laugh. "Kesha showed up at my office this morning, with Troy." Marcus's voice carried professional amusement. "They demanded copies of all your financial documents so she could understand what her husband is hiding. When I explained attorney-client privilege, Troy got loud about the legal system protecting rich men who control their wives." Marcus paused. Security escorted them out after he started yelling about how lawyers like me enable financial abuse. The image of Troy being marched out of a law office by security guards was almost worth the entire situation. But the real damage was happening in social media silence. Jerome's phone showed missed calls from Kesha's friends, their neighbors, couples they'd socialized with. But online? No supportive posts for Kesha, no outraged comments about Jerome's behavior. Just silence, which in their social circle was more damning than criticism. People were watching, waiting, making their own judgments about a woman whose male friend had vanished during her crisis. Carmen, Kesha's best friend, finally got through at 4:00 p.m. "Jerome, I'm not taking sides, but I have to ask, is it true that Kesha never had access to your bank accounts? She's telling people you kept her like a financial prisoner." Jerome chose his words carefully. "Carmen, Kesha has had access to our joint checking and credit cards for 3 years. She's never shown interest in budgets or bills. The only accounts she can't touch are ones that were mine before marriage." There was a long pause. "Jerome, she called me at 2 a.m. asking for help paying for a hotel room, said utilities were getting shut off and she had nowhere to go." Carmen's voice got quieter. "But when I asked why she couldn't stay with Troy since he's been such a good friend, she got defensive and hung up. What's really going on?" The question hung between them, answering itself. Troy's absence in Kesha's actual crisis was becoming impossible for anyone to ignore. The truth was spreading like water, finding its level. Friends who might have sympathized with financial abuse were struggling to understand why her close male friend had disappeared when she needed help most. The man who'd bought expensive jewelry and made confident statements about proper lifestyle had vanished when lifestyle became his responsibility instead of Jerome's. Jerome's mother called that evening, her tone different now. "Son, I talked to Kesha's mother today. Mrs. Williams is beside herself, but she's also angry." His mother paused. "She found out about the jewelry, the restaurant bills, all of it. She asked me point blank if I thought her daughter was cheating on you." Jerome waited, letting his mother work through her thoughts. "I told her I didn't know about cheating, but I knew my son didn't leave his marriage over jealousy about friendship." The final domino fell at 8 p.m. with a text that made Jerome's chest tight. From Kesha's mother. "Jerome, I know you're hurting and my daughter made mistakes. She's my child and she's scared. She's packing tonight to stay with me. I hope you both find peace." 10 minutes later, another message. "I'm ashamed I didn't raise her to be a better wife. You deserved better than what she gave you." Jerome stared at the messages, feeling something fundamental shift. Mrs. Williams had been like a second mother to him, and her disappointment in her own daughter hit harder than Kesha's desperate calls. The woman who'd raised Kesha was taking responsibility for failures that weren't hers, while the woman who'd created the crisis still cast herself as victim. It was the perfect summary of who they all really were when everything else was stripped away. This is what nobody tells you about justice. Sometimes it's not a verdict. Sometimes it's just reality finally catching up. The weekend brought an unexpected call from Mrs. Williams herself, her voice heavy with the kind of exhaustion that comes from confronting ugly truths about people you love. "Jerome, I need to apologize to you properly, not just in a text message." Mrs. Williams took a breath. "My daughter has been living in my house for 2 days, and I've been watching her realize what her life actually looks like when she has to handle it herself." There was a long pause. "She applied for 3 jobs yesterday. 3. In her entire adult life, she's never had to work for anything that mattered." Jerome found himself walking through the hotel parking lot, needing movement to process the conversation. "How is she handling it?" Mrs. Williams' sigh carried the weight of a mother's disappointment badly. "She keeps waiting for you to call and apologize, keeps talking about how you'll come to your senses and realize you need her." The older woman's voice cracked slightly. "Jerome, I had to explain to my 32-year-old daughter how to apply for a job online. She didn't know you need references, didn't understand why employers want to see work history." The reality was settling in for everyone involved. Kesha had spent 3 years as Jerome's wife and learned nothing about functioning as an independent adult. Monday morning brought the kind of revelation that made Jerome's quiet revenge feel almost anticlimactic. Marcus called with an update that was equal parts satisfying and sobering. "The divorce papers are filed, and Kesha's response is exactly what we expected. She's demanding half of everything: the house, your business assets, retirement accounts, even your company stock options." Jerome felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Can she get any of that?" Marcus's laugh was sharp. "She can demand whatever she wants, but demanding and receiving are 2 different things. Most of those assets are separate property acquired before marriage. The house, the investments, even your 401k contributions. All yours." The legal reality was starker than Jerome had imagined. In Georgia, marital property was limited to assets acquired during marriage. And Jerome's careful financial habits had protected him in ways he'd never anticipated. The joint checking account would be split, but it rarely held more than a few $1,000s. The credit card debt Kesha had accumulated would be her responsibility since she'd been the primary user. The lifestyle she'd taken for granted wasn't just unsustainable without Jerome. It had never legally belonged to her in the first place. Tuesday brought news that Jerome hadn't expected to feel good about, but somehow did. Tasha called with an update from Keisha's job search. She got hired at that department store in the mall. You know, the one where she used to shop? There was irony in Kesha working at a store where she'd once spent Jerome's money without thinking about price tags. Full-time retail, $9 an hour, Tuesday through Saturday. How's she taking it? Jerome asked, though he could guess. Like someone who's never had to work retail before. Tasha's voice held no sympathy. She called me crying yesterday because her feet hurt, and her manager talked down to her about showing up on time. The transformation was exactly what Jerome's mother had predicted. That girl is learning what the rest of us figured out a long time ago, his mother had said the night before. That life costs money, and money costs work, and work costs time and effort and dignity you don't want to give up. She's getting an education that's about 20 years overdue. The question is whether she'll learn from it or just feel sorry for herself. Wednesday brought the answer to that question in a text message that made Jerome's chest tight with something between sadness and relief. It was from Kesha herself. The first direct communication since he'd left. Jerome, I understand now that I made mistakes. I see what you were trying to give me and how I threw it away. I know I hurt you and I'm sorry. But we can fix this. I'm working now. I'm learning to handle my own responsibilities. Can we please talk? The message was followed by another an hour later. I miss you. I miss us. Please don't throw away 3 years over one bad mistake. Jerome read the messages 3 times, feeling something he hadn't expected. Pity. Not the kind of pity that leads to reconciliation, but the sad recognition of someone who was finally understanding consequences that should have been obvious all along. Kesha was sorry. But she was sorry because her life had become difficult, not because she'd betrayed someone who'd loved her. She wanted to fix things because she missed the comfort Jerome provided, not because she'd developed respect for the marriage she'd violated. The final piece of moral reckoning came that evening in a call from Carmen. Jerome, I need you to know that a lot of us feel terrible about how this situation developed. We saw things that didn't look right. But we didn't say anything because we didn't want to get involved in your marriage. Carmen's voice carried genuine regret. But Kesha has been calling all of us, asking for money and places to stay, and it's becoming clear that she thought all of us would just take care of her problems. Some of us are starting to understand that maybe you weren't the problem in your marriage. Jerome hung up, feeling something shift in his chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of peaceful closure. The people who mattered were seeing the situation clearly now. Kesha was learning to take responsibility for her choices, even if she was learning it the hard way. And Jerome was discovering that walking away from someone who'd stopped valuing him hadn't made him cruel or heartless. It had simply revealed who everyone really was when the comfortable illusions were stripped away. Drop your story in the comments. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved because they confused love with ownership? 2 years later. Jerome stood in the kitchen of his new townhouse in Buckhead, watching Dr. Angela Foster chop vegetables for dinner with the kind of efficient precision that came from years of surgical training. The morning sun caught the simple gold band on her finger. They'd been married 6 months. A small ceremony with family and close friends who understood that sometimes the best relationships grow from friendship and mutual respect rather than dramatic passion. You're thinking about something, Angela said without looking up from the cutting board. She had a surgeon's ability to notice details others missed, and Jerome had learned to appreciate her direct communication style. Just remembering, he said, pulling coffee mugs from the cabinet they'd chosen together. 2 years ago today was when everything started falling apart with Kesha. Angela nodded thoughtfully. She knew the story, had heard it during their careful courtship, when Jerome was still learning to trust his judgment about women again. The contrast between his 2 marriages was striking in ways that went beyond personality. Angela had insisted on separate bank accounts and a prenuptial agreement. Not from distrust, but from professional experience with couples who'd failed to establish clear boundaries. She paid half the mortgage on the townhouse they'd bought together, contributed to groceries and utilities, handled her own car payment and insurance. Their relationship was a partnership between equals, not a caretaking arrangement disguised as romance. Jerome's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, now serving as best man and legal counsel for a much happier occasion. Saw the news about your software patent approval. Congratulations, man. That royalty check is going to be sweet. The patent application Jerome had filed months before his first marriage fell apart had finally been approved, and the licensing deals were already generating income that dwarfed his corporate salary. The irony wasn't lost on him. The financial success Kesha had taken for granted was nothing compared to what he'd achieved after she was gone. The morning newspaper lay folded on their breakfast table. Jerome found himself scanning the local business section out of habit. There, in a small column about new franchise openings, was a familiar name. Kesha Williams Davis, new owner of successful hair salon in East Atlanta. Jerome stared at the article for a moment, processing the information. Williams was her maiden name, which she'd apparently reclaimed. Davis he didn't recognize. Possibly a new husband. Possibly a business partner. Angela noticed his attention and read over his shoulder. Your ex-wife? Jerome nodded, feeling something he hadn't expected. Genuine gladness for her success. She always talked about wanting to do hair, but never took the steps to make it happen. Looks like she figured it out. The article was brief but positive. Mentioned the salon's community focus and Kesha's plans for expansion. It sounded like she'd found her footing in a way that had nothing to do with depending on someone else's success. Do you want to drive by and see it? Angela asked, her voice carefully neutral. Jerome considered the question seriously. 2 years ago, the idea would have seemed impossible. Too much anger, too much hurt, too much unfinished business. Now it just seemed unnecessary. No, he said finally. I'm glad she's doing well, but that chapter is closed. Angela smiled and kissed his cheek, understanding without needing explanation that closure didn't require confrontation or reconciliation. Just acceptance that some stories end with people going their separate ways. The afternoon brought a barbecue at Tasha's house. Jerome's extended family had gathered to celebrate his patent approval and Angela's recent promotion to chief resident. It was the kind of gathering Jerome had missed during his first marriage. Relaxed, genuine, full of people who were happy for each other's success without keeping score. Angela fit seamlessly into the group, trading medical stories with Jerome's uncle, helping his nieces with their science fair projects. As the sun set over Atlanta, Jerome found himself on Tasha's back deck with a beer and a sense of contentment he'd forgotten was possible. His sister joined him, following his gaze across the suburban landscape. You know what I realized? She said. You're different now. Not just happier, calmer, like you're not waiting for something bad to happen anymore. Jerome considered her observation. During his marriage to Kesha, he'd developed a constant low-level anxiety about money, about her moods, about whether he was doing enough to keep her satisfied. With Angela, there was peace. I think I confused love with caretaking, Jerome said finally. Thought that if I could just provide enough comfort, enough security, enough lifestyle, that would be enough to build a marriage on. He took a sip of his beer. But you can't love someone into respecting you. Tasha nodded thoughtfully. And you can't build a partnership with someone who thinks partnership means you do all the work while they enjoy the benefits. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lights come on across the neighborhood where normal couples shared normal responsibilities and built normal lives together. Jerome's phone buzzed one last time that evening. A notification from his investment app showing the day's portfolio performance. The numbers were good. Better than good. The software company he'd started with his patent money was growing steadily. His traditional investments were performing well, and his new marriage was adding stability rather than draining resources. For the first time in years, Jerome wasn't worried about money or security, or whether the person sleeping beside him would be there in the morning for the right reasons. As they drove home through Atlanta traffic, Angela reached over and took his hand. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "Not for the money or the patents or any of that. I'm proud of you for knowing when to walk away from something that wasn't working, and for being brave enough to try again with someone who could meet you halfway." Jerome squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of truth in her words. Sometimes the greatest victory wasn't in conquering your problems, but in walking away from them and building something better somewhere else. Peace, he'd learned, was always better than revenge. So let me ask you something. How many of you are in relationships right now where you're the only one building, where you're the only one planning, where you're the only one protecting the future while someone else spends the present? How many of you have been called controlling for wanting to know where money goes? How many have been labeled paranoid for noticing things that don't add up? How many have been made to feel crazy for having standards? Here's what Jerome's story teaches us. Financial literacy isn't just about money. It's about power. It's about protection. It's about knowing the difference between what's yours and what someone else is borrowing. Legal ownership matters, not because you don't trust the person you love, but because love doesn't pay mortgages when that person stops loving you back. Separate doesn't mean unequal. Partnership doesn't mean possession. And marriage shouldn't mean surrendering every protection you've built just to prove you're not controlling. Jerome didn't leave Kesha because she let Troy visit. He left because she thought Jerome's patience was weakness. His provision was obligation. His love was ownership. She learned the hard way that the man who builds everything is also the man who can walk away from someone who doesn't value what he's built. And you know what? She's better for it. Working at that salon, supporting herself, learning what the rest of us already knew. That independence starts with being able to take care of yourself. Troy? He learned that being a side piece is easy when someone else pays the bills. But the minute you're asked to actually step up, most people step out. The friends who stayed silent during Kesha's humiliation of Jerome, they learned that complicity has consequences, that choosing comfort over honesty means losing respect. And Jerome? He learned that sometimes the greatest act of self-love is recognizing when someone doesn't love you the same way you love them, and having the courage to choose peace over trying to fix what was never whole. If you're in a situation like Jerome was, document everything. Protect your assets. Know what's legally yours. Consult a lawyer before emotions make decisions for you, and understand that walking away isn't giving up. It's refusing to settle. Share this story. Not the sanitized version where everybody's at fault and nobody's responsible. The real version, where actions have consequences, where patience has limits, where love without respect is just exploitation with better marketing. Because somewhere right now, there's another Jerome working 60-hour weeks for someone who calls him paranoid for noticing his house key in someone else's pocket. There's another Kesha who hasn't learned yet that comfortable doesn't mean permanent. And there's another Troy who thinks he can coast on someone else's work until reality teaches him otherwise, Let them learn from this story instead of their own mistakes. Drop your story in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Share your experience with relationships that looked like partnership but felt like caretaking. Because the more we talk about this, the harder it gets for people to gaslight us into thinking our standards are the problem. Subscribe to channel. Stay just, stay loud, stay free. And remember, peace is always better than revenge. But sometimes the most peaceful thing you can do is let someone experience the natural consequences of taking you for granted. Jerome Washington chose peace. And peace chose him back.